Good morning. It's the Ides of March today, March the 15th. Just getting rolling. And I had a thought I wanted to expand on a bit. Ukraine and Canada are functionally the same country. Obviously, there's a big ocean of difference and, ethnic and historical background where there are differences, but I mean, it's increasingly less so. Chrystia Freeland has effectively been in charge of Canada for quite a while now, ethnic Ukrainian. Um, her grandfather, or perhaps her father, was a deep collaborator with the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and, of course, the Wehrmacht during World War II. Because most Canadians, deep down, they don't root for Hitler in the sense that somebody who, oh, well, Hitler didn't do a whole bunch of terrible things, right? Not in that sense. The Canadians root for Hitler as Hitler, the cartoon movie villain, is depicted, right? Canadians root for the evil, deranged, I want to kill 15 million people in death camps and start wars with every country. That's the Hitler that the Canadians really aspire to. Because deep down at the base of the Canadian soul is this national inferiority complex. I won't say racial simply because I don't think that they are a distinct race. Um, in either case, right, the Ukrainians with the Russians or the Canadians with the Americans. We come from the same stock, broadly speaking, but it's two different civilizational models. In the Ukrainian case, right, they were the bridge to Europe. They were the Europeanized open door. They were smaller, but they were supposed to be more modern. They had friends in the West. They had a future in the West. People forget that the overthrow of the government with the Maidan came downstream of a rejection of a trade deal and an association agreement with the European Union. Canada, much the same, right? Is smaller than the United States in terms of population and capacity, in terms of history, in terms of ambitions, but they see themselves as us, and there's a lot of cross-border activity and many of them in all of our media and institutions. um they're everywhere. They are, if you take the most fervent anti-Semitic ideas, right? In reality it's the Canadians. If there is a dark and hostile conspiracy, and it's pretty straightforward, right? As the deep state gets forced out of America following the election and inauguration and actions of President Donald Trump in his second term, where are these people going? They're going to Europe, they're going to Canada. Well, there's a fight in Europe right now, right, to weaken the EU, to get countries out of the EU, to push for more reasonably minded political parties and leaders in Europe. What's going on in Canada? A retrenchment of the most hostile globalist powers that have within Canada already killed the idea of being Canadian, right? What is a Canadian? The Canadians don't know. Uh, there's no such thing, right? So they must be Americans, by the Canadian government's own admission. But what this leads to, and you see it also in Taiwan and even in Israel, is that when you construct a smaller state to act as a vehicle for the interests of what Professor Mearsheimer would refer to as offshore balancers, right? And in the case of Ukraine, right, it was America and the UK, both offshore powers in this case, stepping in and using Ukraine as a vehicle with which to try to cause as much harm as possible to the Russian state. Conversely, America's enemies in Europe are using Canada as a vehicle to cause as much harm possible as they can to the American people and the American state, right? They send people like Samantha Bee, and the list goes on of nefarious and hostile Canadians. Now, I know that there's plenty of good ones, right? But overall, their Canadianness is their biggest issue. Take any of the good Canadians, of which I am assured there are quite a few, and you strip away basically everything about them. You put them in a context. The good ones come out as American. I know because I've watched a few seasons of Letterkenny, right? What makes that show good? They're functionally indistinguishable from Americans. There's not a great cultural gap there. It's a little rustic, a little quaint. America is a very wide and very federal idea of a country. Every state is different, right? Every state has its own culture. This is why when President Trump talks about them as the 51st state, it makes so much sense, right? We let Louisiana who, by the way, are a bunch of Canadian refugees, right? But we let Louisiana, um, have parishes and their culinary decisions, of which I'm largely a fan, but not always. And, like a lack of roads. We let Oklahoma, and I mean, just a lot of terrible states into the union, if we're going to be honest. So it's fine if we let Canada in. And the idea that they would dilute American democracy. Well, if you keep them as one state only has so much influence, right? Maybe they don't get as many Congress people as they think they should. Or conversely, we just go back to the rule, which was originally in the Constitution, of having one congressperson for every 30,000 people, as opposed to every 500,000 to 1.5 million people, right? You'd have a lot more Congress people. You'd have a Congress of several thousand people. You know what's a lot harder to corrupt than the small little, thing that we have now? A much larger institution. You'd get a lot more people, a lot more young, fresh blood, new ideas, maybe new parties, right? So there are solutions to union where the interests of us get looked out for. But that being said, and this is something we should go into with a pretty clear understanding, right? This is what led to the structural dysfunction and eventual collapse of the Soviet Union, right? When you have these union peoples brought in and they want advantages through that union and they are seen as valuable to that union, right? Often disadvantageous deals to the majority are made. And in the case of Ukraine and Russia, right? The Russian nationalist view on it would be that the Ukrainians were basically parasites on the Russian state, taking, taking, taking. And when they could take no more, they were thrown off the dole. And ever since then, there's been this very, very bitter animosity that leads to, nothing but hatred and bad blood. The Canadians take terrible advantage of us, economically, right? How many industries that could be in America creating jobs for Americans, funding salaries that pay for local American goods and services are instead stationed in these globalist non-countries, Canada and Ireland and Denmark, and they don't have militaries. They don't create things at the scale that we do. They take our companies, they take our intellectual property, they take our markets and the ability to sell goods and services to our people. They avoid paying our taxes. And then they do everything that they can to support the most hostile political elements in this country because they're not apolitical, right? These pharmaceutical device companies that fucked off to Canada, they're not apolitical. Who do they support? They support the globalists. They support the people that are all about war in Ukraine and about every racist policy against white people in the United States that they possibly can. Kind of a bad situation to be in if you think about it. See, we have the hard power where this could stop. This could absolutely be stopped, and it wouldn't even be that crazy or that difficult. It would take a special military operation. It would take more than anything the fortitude to do it, right? Canada is a small country. They have a small standing army. Yeah, it probably would get pretty bitter if you let it drag on, but there's no realistic way that a force could step in and prevent the United States from acting with impunity in Canada unless they were willing to escalate to a level that it just would boggle the mind to see, because at a certain point you'd be discussing strategic nuclear exchanges. This was the issue with American policy in Eastern Europe that Obama identified. He said that America had no core interest in the region, but that the Russians did. And so, because of that, the Russians would have escalatory dominance, meaning that there was no position we could put ourselves in where we would have a fundamental advantage because they could always step a little bit harder because they were that much more bought in and their entire system understood that. And it took quite a while, right? It took for all of the discussion that did take place in 2014, 2015 about Russian invasion of Ukraine. It wasn't. It wasn't. There were, I'm sure, Russian forces, but for the most part, it was people who lived there, and if they were getting help, it was in the form of arms, it was in the form of trainers and intelligence sharing, which anybody who's ever heard of the Green Berets would know exactly what's being talked about. It's not crazy. That's just how kind of the world works. What would happen in Canada? That's a big border. There's a lot of Americans in Canada. There's a lot of Canadians in America. A lot of Canadians who feel, especially after the trucker protests were brutally shut down by the Trudeau dictatorship, and Canadians were repressed pretty harshly for their political beliefs. get their bank accounts and their kids taken away. I get the feeling that there certainly would be support for a liberation of Canada from Canadians, and that it would be supported by freedom-loving people by whom America, I think, is pretty much identified, right? Um, if you're going to, in the shortest way possible, describe an American, it's typically somebody who's happy to go across the world to fight and die for the idea that people that are ungrateful to them should not be slaves, right? I think that that's perhaps our most lasting humanitarian legacy, and I hope it would be a good one, even though in practice it's often been pretty evil, right? Like the outcomes of it are really dark and cynical. Just ask Butler. I want to say Brackett, but that's a stupid last name, and that's not his name. Guy who wrote War is a Racket, which is, I'm sure, why I'm thinking of the word bracket. Smedley Butler, who the business plot tried to get to overthrow the government, and probably should have listened, honestly. But he talked about all the banana wars, right? But what would happen is we'd get these impressionable young people to serve their country, to do these noble things, and that they get the Congress to empower it, and the bureaucracy and the people aligned behind it. But what it really was cynical plays for power and money and the region by American corporations and interests. That's fine. That frankly, that's a good thing if it's properly constructed. What's happened in many ways is that we've seen, instead of just institutional capture or corporate capture, we've seen the interest groups which manage the affairs of the Leviathan of state become directly captured, right? And that's a real problem. When everyone's kids are going through some sort of like radical indoctrination, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but if you disagree with it, you're violently attacked. It leads to you know, it leads to the best and brightest not wanting to do it. It leads to a failure of functional responses, and it leads to a situation where nobody can get anything done. Meow, indeed. Meow, indeed. What that leads to, and where we need to go with all of this, is we need to launch action, lasting action, total action against the Canadians. We need to seize the structure of their government. We need to control their military leadership, and we need to bring them into a union with the United States. Because if we don't bring them into union with the United States, there will forever and always be an irresolvable tension, not just between the Canadians, but between the strengths of the powers on the North American continent. And with that, I leave you and wish you a wonderful rest of your day.